Lesson 35, a mission of saving. So, the last few weeks we've been talking about life in Nauvoo in the Nauvoo time period. Um, this lesson talks about leaving Nauvoo. So, in late summer of 1845, the Mormon leaders had decided um, it was time to move to the Great Basin, what they called it. On September 9th, the next year, they resolved to send 1,500 men to the Great Salt Lake Valley to find a location for the Saints, and they began to buy and build their own wagons. Now, the next month, in October of 1845, a Nauvoo newspaper gave a recommended list of what you should put in your wagon for the journey west, and it included 1,000 pounds of flour, 20 pounds of soap for each family, 1 gallon of alcohol, a pound each of cayenne and cinnamon, 25 to 100 pounds of farming and repair tools, and some other good scene and a hook. So there's a picture there, wagons loaded up, ready to go. And that was at the beginning, when they were first starting their trek west, that was the recommended list. And a migration started that would last for more than a decade of people migrating west to Salt Lake. Now, the first Mormons arrived in the Salt Lake Valley on July 21st of 1847. Brigham Young was in that company, but he arrived 3 days later. And that's that day, July 24th, is when he gave the famous quote, "This is the right place." And by December of that year, more than 2,000 people had come to the Salt Lake Valley. And over the next 9 years, 30,000 people in 187 companies migrated west. A lot of these people were able to do that through something called the Perpetual Immigration Fund. It was a fund instituted in 1849 when the church allocated $5,000 to aid impoverished converts on their westward migration. The goal of it was to help people reach the state of Deseret. And then once established, the idea was that those people who had borrowed money from the Perpetual Immigration Fund, would repay what they had received, and then thus keep the fund solvent and allow other people to use it and come. So there was an interest rate on that, and they would borrow. They would come over to Salt Lake, set up shop, and then they would pay back in, and other people could borrow. It kind of stemmed from the covenant in 1846 when the Mormons abandoned Nauvoo and they relocated further west, and they pledged that they would never desert the poor who are worthy. And so they wanted to make sure everybody that wanted to come to Salt Lake could make it. And so that was the Perpetual Immigration Fund. Now, a well-known story in Mormon history is in 1848, the summer after they arrived in Salt Lake. The first crop, they had planted a bunch of crops, and their first crop in Utah was threatened by a plague of crickets. And it's their first year that it's really important that this crop gets harvested. So fearing the loss of food that they needed for survival, the settlers fought the insects with every possible means, everything they could think of. But it was a losing battle. And just when it appeared that all was lost, in answer to prayer, a white cloud of seagulls flew in and devoured all the crickets. This is a well-known story. It's recorded in a lot of diaries. There's statues to seagulls in Salt Lake now. It's quite quite the event, and that happened the first year after the Saints moved there. But they had similar cricket problems in 1855 and 1856. There was crop failures then. In 1855, 2/3 of the crops were devoured. and there were no seagulls, regardless of the prayers. I mean, it was fresh in their memory, and yet it never happened. The crops were devoured. And this actually led to what's known as the Mormon Reformation. It's a very interesting topic that we don't have time for now, but I would recommend anybody to just Google that. Google Mormon Reformation and read about what transpired with around this time frame in relation to these crop failures, how they viewed it and what they did with it. But with these crop failures, not only were they short on food, but a lot of the farmers couldn't sell it to make money. There was some failed business ventures around the same time that the church got into, and it really put some pressure on the Perpetual Immigration Fund. A lot of the immigrants were unable to make their payments, and yet more and more people were requesting funds from the Perpetual Immigration Fund. And so we had this really problematic chain of events where we had more and more people trying to pull money out, requesting money from the Perpetual Immigration Fund, but the inflow of cash into that fund is drying up pretty quick. And so we need something else. We need a way to deal in this new paradigm of less money coming in, but more money being requested out. And so what do they think of? Well, they think of handcarts. In a letter that Brigham Young wrote to Franklin D. Richards, who was the president of the mission in Britain at the time, he says, "We cannot afford to purchase wagons and teams as in times past. I am consequently thrown back upon my old plan to make handcarts, and let the immigration foot it and draw upon them the necessary supplies, having a cow or two for every 10. They can come just as quick, if not quicker, and much cheaper, can start earlier and escape the prevailing sickness which annually lays so many of our brethren in the dust. A great majority of them walk now, even with the teams which are provided." So, obviously, one small handcart per family is much cheaper than a wagon and a mule team, or ox, or whatever it is you decide to pull your wagon. And so this was kind of the answer to how are we going to get all of these immigrants coming to Salt Lake when the Perpetual Immigration Fund is struggling to stay solvent, right? Now, handcarts, it was not a new thing. It was not the brainchild of Brigham Young. Handcarts were fairly well known in metropolitan centers. A lot of street vendors would use them to pull their wares through the streets and sell them. In fact, they're still used in many countries today. Street vendors use handcarts to cart their merchandise around. Now, remember the list in the Nauvoo newspaper about what to bring on your journey west, what to put in your wagon, right? 1,000 pounds of flour, all kinds of other things. Well, handcarts obviously can't handle that much, so there was weight restrictions put on them that we'll talk about in a little bit. But over the next few years, there were multiple handcart companies. They were used for about 4 years, 10 handcart companies. Nearly 3,000 immigrants used handcarts, and there was about 650 handcarts total in those 10 handcart companies. And in those handcarts, like I said, there was weight restrictions. Instead of 1,000 pounds of flour for everybody, they put the flour in a couple of wagons, and in your handcart you were allowed 17 pounds per adult and 10 pounds per child. So what we saw was a lot of family heirlooms, a lot of things that people had, at great expense brought over from England or from wherever they were from, was being left in winter quarters and Iowa City and places where they were joining these handcart companies. Now, I'd like to talk for just a minute about a couple specific people who were in these handcart companies. One of which is Elizabeth Sermon here. She was an English convert, and she prayed for the opportunity to follow her Mormon faith to America. But her husband, Joseph, he was not sure the move was the best choice for the family. They had a good life in England. He had a good job, But she ultimately convinced him, and they packed up their 4 children in February of 1856, hopped on the sailing ship Caravan, and traveled to the United States. They ultimately reached Florence in the Nebraska Territory, which, when founded, was founded by the Mormons and called winter quarters that first year as they were leaving Nauvoo. At first, they rented a house, but money eventually grew tight, so they bought a tent and moved into a tent there in winter quarters, and that's where they lived. And that summer, they watched as other converts passed through Florence and on the Mormon Trail, off heading to Salt Lake. Um, Joseph, her husband, was hesitant to take the family any farther west. They were already at the far reaches of the American frontier. Right, it wasn't that hard. There was some trains, carriages, decent roads getting to Florence, but once you got there, it was wilderness everywhere west of there. But Elizabeth, ultimately, as she had persuaded him to leave England, she persuaded him to continue to Zion. So they bought a wagon and a mule team for the journey. Now, this was right at the time when handcarts were viewed as the answer to some of the problems with the migration. So the church leaders actually convinced her that it was God's will that they sell their wagon and the animals and buy a handcart, and then with whatever proceeds were left over from the sale after they purchased their own handcart, they could donate that to other immigrants who didn't have the funds so that they could also buy handcarts. So that's what they did. And they joined Martin's Handcart Company when it pulled away from Cutler's Park in Florence on August 25th, 1856. And they were carrying provisions expected to last about 60 days. So that's Elizabeth's sermon. That's her story. She actually her and her husband bought a wagon and a mule team to make the journey west, and were convinced by their church leaders that it was better to go by handcart in the Martin Handcart Company. So that's what they did. Now, Patience Loader, another immigrant from England, she left Liverpool on December 10th, 1855 on the ship John J. Boyd with her parents, her sisters, brothers, and one of her sisters, her husband, her brother-in-law, John Jacks, did not leave with the family. He was actually, I believe, executive secretary for the England mission, and he was working in the mission office there, and he was coordinating a lot of this immigration and the missionary work. And so he was planning on leaving the following summer and heading to Zion, but he didn't go with the family. They were at sea for about 11 weeks, much longer than the typical ocean crossing at the time, and that was mostly due to stormy weather. There's some great stories of the storm, and all of this. The church on LDS.org, they've put up a lot of these journals, and so these two people, Patience Loader and Elizabeth Sermon, you can read their journals and their stories all on history.lds.org, I believe. Great, really interesting. But while they were at sea, the captain was a drunkard. One night he kicked the stove over and the ship caught fire, and the crew had to put it out. There was a lot of things like that going on. And Patience Loader actually recorded she had a very interesting experience. She said, "Once while the storm was raging, the curtains of my berth separated, and a bright light shone through, and I saw a person whom I had never seen before standing in the light, which was so bright I could not see the color of his eyes. Oh, I could see the color of his eyes. They were brown, and he had lovely hair. He spoke to me, saying, 'Fear not, you shall be taken over safely.' Then the curtains were drawn. I called to father and mother in the next berth, and told them not to fear, for I believed I had seen the Savior, and they felt to rely on this promise." So even though the weather was terrible and the captain was mean and a drunkard, she had a vision, and she knew that they were going to make it safely to the New World, which they did. They landed in New York in February of 1856, and they immediately rented some rooms, got some jobs, and they planned to kind of establish themselves, build up a little bit of savings, and then the following year they would buy some wagons and some teams and head over to Salt Lake. Now, on March 29th, John Jacks, her brother, who was in the mission home in England, wrote a letter to her father saying that President Richard ordered them to Zion via handcart. See, they had gotten jobs. They couldn't quite afford the wagon and the teams yet, but they were planning on going next year. And they got this letter, and Patience went to John Taylor, who was in New York at the time. He was kind of, the mission home in England was sending people over to America. John Taylor was in charge of the office in New York that was receiving them and then sending them to winter quarters, where there was another kind of checkpoint, I guess you could say, and then they would head over to Salt Lake. So Patience went to John Taylor, and she tried to get reprieve and explain to him, we don't, we're here, we got jobs, we're going to go to Zion next year once we've, got our things in order. She said, I could not see it right at all to want us to do such a humiliating thing, to be said harnessed up like cattle and pull a handcart loaded up with our bedding and cooking utensils. John Taylor did show a little bit of sympathy because, Patience said, my father only has daughters. You expect his daughters to pull these handcarts when next year we could go by wagon. But at any rate, didn't give her much reprieve there. And so she wrote to her brother John Jacks a letter of protest, said, I don't want to go yet. We need to, get ourselves established and get a wagon and a team, and we'll go when we're ready. And John Jacks didn't just write her back, but he published her letter and his reply in the Millennial Star. And his reply was very harsh. You can see it on the website that I referenced, and also on my website. There's a link to it. But in this public rebuke, he said a lot of things, but one of the things he said is, there is not one atom of the spirit of Zion in it, but the very spirit of apostasy. I felt to exclaim in my heart, who has bewitched you, that you should so soon forget the goodness of the Lord in delivering you from this part of Babylon and opening up your way to Zion? It astonishes me that you wish to stay in New York. After you have left one part of Babylon, I wonder how you can think of sitting down in another. This is typical of Mormon thought at the time. People, there was the idea that the end was soon, and Babylon, the world, was going to be destroyed, and Zion was Salt Lake Valley, and that's where you needed to be. So obviously, with such a public rebuke, Patience Loader's father decided, well, okay, we should go. We'll go by handcart, and we'll go to Zion now instead of wait like we were planning until we were more prepared and had a wagon and a team and some resources. We'll go now because that's what they're telling us to do. So they also went west and ended up joining the Martin Handcart Company. So here you can see a map of the Northeast and Midwest United States, and you can see the path that is followed. The arrow points to Florence, which was also winter quarters, and that is where, as I mentioned earlier, that is where the carriages stopped, the train line stopped. That is where everything kind of, all the main modes of transportation stopped, and that was the far reaches of the western U.S. at the time. Beyond that was wilderness, and beyond that is where the handcart journey, that's where the handcart journey started. That's where you picked up your handcarts there in winter quarters. They were building them, and that's where, there's no more carriages, there's no more trains, there's no more anything else. If you had a wagon, you were going by wagon. If you had a handcart, that's where your handcart journey started. Now, one of the issues with the Willie and Martin handcart companies was a lack of coordination between New York, winter quarters, and Salt Lake. Normally, when people got there, there was handcarts ready to go for them, but when these saints arrived, there was not. And so Chauncey Webb was the lead carpenter, and he, even though he didn't really want to, he rapidly got a bunch of handcarts built out of green wood, which he, warned would fall apart. You needed dried, cured, hard wood to build these handcarts with, but they didn't have any. They were cutting down trees to build these as quick as they could because they had these people showing up for handcart companies that they hadn't prepared for. So most of the handcarts, if not all the handcarts in the Martin and Willie handcart companies, were made out of green wood. And the guys who knew, Chauncey Webb, said, these are going to fall apart on the trail and they're going to cause a bunch of delays because they're going to break down all the time. But at any rate, that's this map here shows from where the arrow is over to Salt Lake. That is that's the route of the handcart companies, and that's the part, or the route of the immigration, and that's the part of the immigration that was when they were pulling handcarts. Now, Levi Savage is kind of a well-known figure in this story. He had been called to serve a mission in Siam, which we now call Thailand, but he never made it due to paperwork, like visa delays. They even had those back then. So he ended up spending 2 years in Burma, had very little success, and so was heading back to Salt Lake. He arrived in Iowa City about 4 days before the Willie party set out. Captain Willie immediately recognized his experience and his skills and conscripted him to be a sub-captain. He accepted, and in August 11th, they arrived in Florence in winter quarters, getting ready to go west. Now, on August 13th, they had a big meeting to discuss the trek west. And according to Levi Savage's journal, he says, Captain Willie told the saints to press on regardless of suffering, even death. Then asked Levi if he wanted to talk. And Levi said, I said to him that if I spoke, I must speak my mind, let it cut where it would. He said, certainly do so. So this is already August, right? The handcart companies were not supposed to start their trek west after May. So we're going on 2.5 months past the drop dead date for when it's okay to leave. And some of the saints are thinking maybe this isn't a good idea. Chauncey Webb is there saying, hey, these handcarts are green, they're going to break down. A lot of these people, Patience Loader, Elizabeth Sermon, and many others already weren't super thrilled with the idea of pulling a handcart. They had other plans. The Sermons even had a wagon and a mule team that they sold. They were in the Martin handcart company, but the same thing was going on in the Willie handcart company. And so they had this meeting where Captain Willie and a few others spoke, encouraging them that they should go. And when Levi Savage got up to talk, he told Captain Willie before he did that he's going to speak his mind, let it cut where it would. And so he got up and he said that they shouldn't go. He said, if we go now, we will be in snow up to our knees. We will have to wrap ourselves in thin blankets. We'll lie on frozen ground. It's too late in the season. We should not go. This is not safe. It is not smart. We should stay here and wait until spring. Well, immediately after he sat down, he was publicly rebuked by the church leaders. Captain Willie said that the God he served was a God that could save in the utmost, and that these people needed to have faith, and that God would protect them, and they're going to Zion, which is a righteous desire, and so God will protect them. Another guy, William Kimball, who was going to come over, President Richards from the English mission was headed to Salt Lake, and William Kimball was going to be riding in that wagon train, and he got up and said he would stuff into his mouth all the snow they would ever get to see on their journey to the valleys. He told them that God would not let it snow, and that they would, if it did snow, it would, he would stuff it into his mouth. And they publicly rebuked Levi Savage. They made an appeal to faith that God would protect them. And Levi Savage, sitting there, knew what was going to happen. He had said it, and he knew that what was going to happen, and so he tried to resign, but it was declined. And Captain Willie said, "No, I'm not letting you resign." And so then a vote was taken, and they said, "Who wants to go?" And Levi Savage was the only opposing vote. Now, a few days later, when the Martin Company was headed out, they had a similar thing happen where Chauncey Webb, the guy building the handcarts, was the only guy telling them, "Don't go." But again, they were appealing to faith, and they were going. So we have a couple things here, right? We have all the immigrants who are basically, a lot of them are city slickers. Not all of them, but they come from big cities in England. A lot of them are not used to the wilderness, the wild west of the U.S., and so they're apprehensive. They maybe don't want to pull a handcart. They may not think it's a good idea, but they're listening to their leaders who are making this appeal to faith, right? And telling them that they should. And so they decided to go. After the vote was taken and everybody said they wanted to go except for Levi Savage, he stood up and he said, "Brethren and sisters, what I have said to you I know to be true. But seeing you are to go forward, I will go with you, will help you all I can, will work with you, will rest with you, will suffer with you, and if necessary, I will die with you. May God in his mercy bless and preserve us." He knew what he was getting into, and he tried to tell them, but he went with them anyways. So on August 16th, the Willie Company leaves Florence, about 646 people pulling 120 handcarts and 5 wagons. They had about 24 oxen and 45 beef cattle and cows. Not much after that, on August 25th, the Martin Company left Florence. They had about 503 people pulling 146 handcarts plus 7 wagons, a carriage for Martin, a freight wagon loaded with church goods, and some 50 head of milk cows and beef cattle. In addition to these two, there were also 2 wagon trains that were going around the same time, and they were kind of leapfrogging each other. The wagons, had some supplies and whatever else. But the 2 we want to focus on are the handcart companies there. Now, on September 12th, not long after that, the Willie Company was overtaken by the group of returning missionaries from Europe in carriages and wagons, and that included Franklin D. Richards and William Kimball, the guy who told the saints in the Willie Company that he would stuff into his mouth any snow that they would see on their journey to the valleys. And so on October 4th, 1856, that Swift Shore train of those returning missionaries arrive in Salt Lake. They had a very fast trip across the plains, right? September 12th, they're passing the Willie Company. October 4th, they're arriving in Salt Lake. It's a warm day, calm, and there they are in Salt Lake. Now, it's unclear if Salt Lake leadership understood that there were still more companies on the trail. There were some letters back and forth between New York and Salt Lake, but it's not clear who in Salt Lake was getting those letters and what they did about it. But at any rate, when this wagon train arrived in Salt Lake, they announced and made everybody aware that there were at least 4 companies, right? The 2 wagon trains and the Martin and Willie handcart companies, altogether numbering more than 1,000 saints, spread across the plains, still trying to make it in. This is October 4th, 1856. And I think a lot of people have heard the story where Brigham Young gets up and he says, I shall call on the bishops this day. I shall not wait until tomorrow, nor until the next day, for 60 good mule teams and 12 or 15 wagons. I do not want to send oxen. I want good horses and mules. They are in this territory, and we must have them. Also, 12 tons of flour and 40 good teamsters, besides those that drive the teams. He goes on to say, I will tell you all that your faith, religion, and profession of religion will never save one soul of you in the celestial kingdom of our God, unless you carry out just such principles as I am now teaching you. Go and bring in those people now on the plains. Right, so they gathered up these teams and flour and everything to go out and gather these people up, because they knew, right? It's October 4th. These people should have been getting in the valley a long time ago. Winter is coming, right? And so when you look at the Martin and Willie handcart companies, I'm not going to go into detail about what happened out on the plains. A lot of us have heard those stories before, but what I do want to point out is it is the worst disaster in Western migration. Nearly 250 people of the 900 members of the Martin and Willie handcart companies died, mostly from cold and starvation. That compares to only 42 members of the Donner Party who perished in the Sierras, which is a much more well-known event in Western migration. But it's clear that when you look at all of the Western migration, the Oregon Trail, the Mormon Trail, all of that Western movement, this is far and away the worst disaster that happened. And now, an interesting note is that more people in both the Willie and Martin handcart companies died after the rescuers reached them than during all the previous weeks of their trek from Iowa to western Wyoming. Right? This isn't like today, right? The rescuers aren't pulling up in cars and buses that are heated and dry. They've got some food, they've got some blankets, but they're still exposed to the elements. By the time the rescuers got to them, these people were already near death due to exposure to the cold, starvation, and so even though the rescuers were there and they had food and maybe they had some warm blankets and things like that, more of the saints died after the rescuers got there before they got to Salt Lake than in the entire trek prior to that. They were in dire straits when the rescuers arrived. Now, we frequently look at this and we talk about it from a faith perspective, right? It built their faith. But really, it's the worst disaster in Western migration, and it never needed to happen. We didn't need all of these people to die. It didn't have to happen, right? When we look at the chain of events that happens, there's a series of things that it was just a perfect storm, right? They get to Florence and there's no handcarts, and so they're building them out of green wood, and the superintendent over the carpenters who's doing that, saying this is not a good idea. These handcarts are going to break down. They're going to cause delays. This is the end of the season. We don't have time for delays. Now, Chauncey Webb, the guy who was saying that and building those, he actually hopped into the wagon train with President Richards and went down to Salt Lake. He is one of only a handful that immediately turned back around with the rescue teams to go save these people, because he knew, and he told them in Florence, don't go, wait until spring. But they did it anyway. Not only that, they didn't listen to reason, right? They all knew that it was too late to leave. Brigham Young had said that handcart companies shouldn't leave until after May, and that's a lot of the reason why they think that there was, normally the handcart companies there was stations along the trail where you could resupply, and the Martin and Willie handcart companies, when they got there was no supplies there, and it's because they shouldn't have left. It was too late, and both companies. The Willie company had Levi Savage. He was experienced. He had been to Salt Lake. He had been on that trail. He knew what it was like. He got up and he told them exactly what would happen, but they didn't listen to him, because they had these leaders saying, have faith. My God is a God who will save. And so they didn't listen to him, and Chauncey Webb said the same thing for the Martin company, but they didn't listen to him. They didn't listen to reason, and they they followed their leaders into this disaster, and then they made some pretty serious mistakes. There was as people got more and more sick, they needed places in the wagons to put these people, right? Because they couldn't walk, and so they took the flour out of the wagons and put it in the carts, which made the carts much heavier. It made them break down more because of the weight on that green wood. It was just it just compounded the problem, right? And then even the Martin Company at one point decided we need to lighten the loads so we can move quicker. So they took out their blankets, they took out their extra clothes, and they put it in a big pile. And then the leadership said, well, if we leave it in this big pile, people might, be tempted to turn around and come get it when they get cold. So they burned it. The blankets, the warm clothing that they were going to need to survive, they put it in a big pile and they burned it, right? So there was just a series of bad decisions and mistakes that caused this to happen. As I was researching this on the internet, I came across a meme that said, everything happens for a reason, but sometimes that reason is you're stupid and make bad decisions. Now, I'm not trying to talk bad about any of the people there. I've read a lot of their journals. It's all online. You can read it too. These were good people. A lot of them, though, like I said, they were city slickers. They didn't know what they were getting into. Even some of the leadership that should have known better didn't. And I'm not trying to talk bad about them. I'm just trying to point out that there was a series of bad decisions that culminated in the worst disaster in Western migration, and it didn't need to happen. And something that we don't always realize or talk about is when we're talking about the rescue teams. Brigham Young said we need all of this flour, 40 tons or whatever it was. We need this, we need that, and we need them to go now. When they got 18 miles out of Salt Lake, according to the journals of some of them, the snow was up to the bows of their wagons. Right. So these guys, they were putting themselves in danger. They were as much in danger as the people that they were trying to save, right? Because they were in wagons. They were exposed to the elements. They weren't moving very fast because these wagons were loaded down, and they were in extremely deep snow. They got a lot of snow that winter, and it came really early. And so they're trying to push forward, but these rescuers are risking their own lives and the lives of their teams to do it. And in fact, some of them turned back. There's one guy, he made it to Fort Bridger, and then he ended up turning around. And as he was going back to the Salt Lake Valley, every rescue wagon that he encountered that was heading east, he told them to turn around. And so they all turned around. And in all, 77 wagons turned back to Salt Lake. 77 wagons full of blankets, full of warm clothes, full of flour and food turned back. Now, of course, when Brigham Young heard about this, he said, no, we can't have you guys turn around. So he dispatched a fast team on a couple quick horses. He says, you go out there and you turn those wagons back around, right? They need to get out there and they need to get those supplies to those people out on the plains. Hosea Stout, great guy, excellent journal keeper, was one of those people that Brigham Young dispatched. And he wrote in his journal, when he met Van Cott, the guy, he was the leader who was turning around all the wagons, and said, what in the world are you doing? Van Cott said that he could get no information of them, right? He went to Fort Bridger, and there was nothing there to tell him about the immigrants. He said, I could get no information of them. And so he had concluded that they returned to the States, they turned around and went back to winter quarters, or they stopped at Laramie, or they had been killed by the Indians, or otherwise gone to the devil. And to go further was to only lose his own team and starve to death himself and do no good after all, right? So when Hosea Stout said, why did you turn around, and why are you turning around all of the 77 wagons? You're desperately needed out on the plains. Van Cott said, hey, have you seen the winter going on right now? If these people were smart, they either turned around or they've stopped somewhere, at Laramie or somewhere, or if they kept going, they've either been killed by the Indians or otherwise gone to the devil, right? They're not, it's suicide. It's suicide to go out there and try to rescue them because they're already dead or they're not there. But Hosea Stout was successful in turning them around. And so all the wagons, the rescue wagons, did turn around, did go out, and eventually find them and help bring them to the valley. Now, the point that I want to make here is that these people made a series of bad decisions. Some of it was probably they knew it was a bad decision. Some of these bad decisions were made out of ignorance. But they made a series of bad decisions which put them in a very dire place, a place where they were going to die if left on their own. They needed help. They needed rescuers, right? And how many of us have looked at somebody and said, well, that person's probably in that position because of mistakes that they've made, decisions that they've made that put them there, right? How many of us have looked at people and said that? Said that, oh, that person is in that situation because of bad decisions that they have made, right? How many of us are like those rescuers who are turning around saying, I'm not going out there to save them. That's going to make me uncomfortable, right? I'd rather be home in my warm, cozy house. I'm not going to go brave the elements, make myself uncomfortable to potentially help somebody who, they're there because of decisions that they made, right? How many of us do that? I think it happens a lot. An interesting story that happened in New Zealand, it was a social experiment put on by a police department in New Zealand. They hired an actor, a kid, to stand on a very busy street corner and dig through the trash and look for food. And they, made him look really dirty and scuffed his hair and whatever else. And then they filmed it. And they wanted to see how people would react. Over the course of a half an hour, over 500 people walked by this boy as he was digging through trash cans looking for food and did not say or do anything. Some people actually avoided him. They looked at him and they avoided him, or they needed to throw something away and he's digging through the trash and they're kind of dancing around him. For a half an hour, the police are watching as over 500 people walk right by. Eventually, after a little more than a half an hour, a group of schoolgirls stop and start talking to him and say, hey, are you okay? Do you need some food? Do you need some money? And try to help him out. But how many of us are like those 500 people who walked right by? How many of us are like Van Cott, the rescuer, who is thinking to ourselves, are you serious? I need to go help people? That's going to make me uncomfortable. That's going to make me go out of my way. It's not really something I want to do. I might jeopardize myself. Maybe I might jeopardize my reputation if I'm seen with these people, right? How many of us don't really want to help? And we justify it by saying, well, they're probably there because of decisions they made. Or if I give them money, they're just going to use it to buy alcohol anyways, so I shouldn't help them out. How many of us judge in that way? Well, King Benjamin actually talked about that. He said, perhaps thou shalt say, the man has brought upon himself his misery. Therefore I will stay my hand, and will not give unto him of my food, nor impart unto him of my substance, that he may not suffer, for his punishments are just. But I say unto you, O man, whosoever doeth this, the same hath great cause to repent. And except he repenteth of that which he hath done, he perisheth forever, and hath no interest in the kingdom of God. And if ye judge the man who putteth up his petition to you for your substance, that he perisheth not, and condemn him, how much more will be your condemnation for withholding your substance? There was a great talk given by a university professor, Professor Catherine Corman Perry, given on the BYU campus, and she talked about judging, and she talks about Mary and Martha, where the Lord comes to see them, and Mary sits at his feet and listens, and Martha is busying herself. She's kind of cleaning up, she's cooking some food, and then it says in Luke, but Martha was cumbered about much serving, and came to him and said, Lord, dost thou not care that my sister has left me to serve alone? Bid her therefore that she help me. And Jesus answered and said unto her, Martha, Martha, thou art careful and troubled about many things, but one thing is needful, and Mary has chosen that good part, which shall not be taken away from her. Now the Lord immediately he acknowledges Martha's care, right? He says, Martha, Martha, thou art careful and troubled about many things. But then he delivers the gentle but clear rebuke. And the rebuke wouldn't have come, this is what Professor Perry is saying, it wouldn't have come if Martha had not prompted it, right? The Lord didn't go into the kitchen and tell Martha, hey, you need to stop cooking and come listen. I'm teaching here. He was content to let her serve him however she cared to until she judged another person. She said, Lord, dost thou not care that my sister hath left me to serve alone? Bid her therefore that she help me. Martha's self-importance, expressed through her judgment of her sister, occasioned the Lord's rebuke, not her busyness with the meal, right? And then uh, Professor Perry goes on to talk about Simon, and also in Luke chapter 7, where it says, And behold, a woman in the city which was a sinner, when she knew that Jesus sat at meat in the Pharisee's house, brought an alabaster box of ointment, and stood at his feet behind him weeping, and anointed them with the ointment. Now when the Pharisee which had bidden him saw it, he spake within himself, saying, This man, if he were a prophet, would have known who and what manner of woman this is that toucheth him, for she is a sinner. And Jesus answering said unto him, Simon, I have somewhat to say unto thee. And he saith, Master, say on. There was a certain creditor which had two debtors. The one owed 500 pence, and the other 50. And when they had nothing to pay, he frankly forgave them both. Tell me, therefore, which of them will love him most? Simon answered and said, I suppose that he, to whom he forgave most. And he said unto him, Thou hast rightly judged. And he turned to the woman and said unto Simon, Seest thou this woman? I entered into thine house, thou gavest me no water for my feet, but she hath washed my feet with tears, and wiped them with the hairs of her head. Thou gavest me no kiss, but this woman since the time I came in hath not ceased to kiss my feet. My head with oil thou didst not anoint, but this woman hath anointed my feet with ointment. Wherefore I say unto thee, her sins, which are many, are forgiven, for she loved much. But to whom little is forgiven, the same loveth little. So similar to before with Mary and Martha, Simon makes two judgments. One, that the woman is a sinner, and two, that Jesus is no prophet, or he would know her to be a sinner. Both of these judgments, however, he did not speak, like in Mary and Martha. They didn't say anything because it says he speaks them within himself. But interestingly, the scriptures continue, and Jesus answering said unto him. So even though Simon did not speak these thoughts, Jesus read these thoughts and still rebuked him in the same way. And it wasn't until Simon judged somebody else that the Lord rebuked him, right? And in both of these cases, it's all about our choices, right? Now, here in Moroni chapter 7, a beautiful verse of scripture about charity. For none is acceptable before God save the meek and lowly in heart. And if a man be meek and lowly in heart and confesses by the power of the Holy Ghost that Jesus is the Christ, he must needs have charity. For if he have not charity, he is nothing. Wherefore he must needs have charity. And charity suffereth long, and is kind, and envieth not, and is not puffed up, seeketh not her own, is not easily provoked, thinketh no evil, and rejoiceth not in iniquity, but rejoiceth in the truth, bearing all things, believeth all things, hopeth all things, endureth all things. Wherefore, my beloved brethren, if ye have not charity, ye are nothing. For charity never faileth. Wherefore cleave unto charity, which is the greatest of all, for all things must fail. But charity is the pure love of Christ, and it endureth forever. And whoso is found possessed of it at the last day, it shall be well with him. Right? If ye have not charity, ye are nothing. But whoso is found possessed of charity at the last day, it shall be well with him. right? Are we those rescuers that are sent out to help people who are in a very bad situation by their own making? Bad decisions that they made, whether it's bad decisions they made themselves or whether they chose to follow somebody making bad decisions. Are we those rescuers who get out and we start feeling a little uncomfortable and decide, well, I'm going to turn around. I'm not going to help those people. If we are, then we really need to do some soul searching, right? Like King Benjamin said, like Moroni is saying, if we are judging those people, if we do not have charity and we are not helping out everybody that even asks, that's what King Benjamin said. Anybody that even asks, we need to help. So in closing, the words of the Savior, when a lawyer asked him, which is the great commandment in the law? The first one, thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart and with all thy soul and with all thy mind. This is the first and great commandment. And the second is like unto it, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. Love thy neighbor as thyself. Have you ever made a bad decision that put you in a place that you couldn't get out of on your own, where you needed somebody to come and help? Have you ever done that and done it in such a way that somebody needed to leave their comfort zone to come and rescue you? If we're going to love our neighbor as ourselves, we should not worry about our comfort zone. We should not worry about our reputation. We should not worry about whether or not that person did it to themselves by bad decisions that they made. We should be helping everybody. Christ-like love, charity, means we help everybody in every situation, regardless of how they got into that situation. And I think that's one of the best lessons that we can learn from the Willie and Martin Handcart companies. The worst disaster in Western migration didn't need to happen, but it did because of a series of bad decisions and mistakes. And the rescuers turned around. A lot of them did, because it was a little uncomfortable. They were concerned about themselves. And we can draw parallels from that to many people that we meet who need help. And maybe the situation that they're in is by their own doing because of bad decisions that they made, but it's not up to us to judge. We need to love everybody with that Christ-like love of charity. Thank you.